Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Adalah-NY, Campaign for the Boycott of Israel, and Jewish Voice for Peace, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's panel, Free Speech Palestine. I want to thank our moderator, Sarah Schulman, our panelists, Suzanne Abulhawa, Aja Monet, and Radhika Sainath, for being with us tonight. I want to thank Verso Books for hosting us, and I want to thank our sponsors, Verso, Haymarket, Just World, OR, and the Palestine Festival of Literature. Thank you. The Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions provides one of the most effective ways that people of conscience around the world can stand in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. In 2004, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel urged international cultural workers and organizations to boycott Israel till it ended its occupation, colonization, and system of apartheid. This boycott includes canceling events sponsored by Israel or carried out by complicit Israeli cultural institutions, and rejecting funding or any type of sponsorship from the Israeli government. Since then, thousands of artists and cultural workers around the world in the UK and Canada and the US and South Africa have signed public statements in support of cultural boycott. Others have canceled their performances in Israel or declined to perform there. And numerous cultural institutions have rejected Israeli government funding. For example, here in New York, since 2014, the Brooklyn Book Festival has not accepted Israeli government funding after festival participants and other prominent writers sent a letter to organizers asking them to reject Israeli government sponsorship. And following a 2-year campaign by Adalah-NY and JVP, and a petition signed by over 240 prominent writers, including Suzanne Abulhawa, Russell Banks, Angela Davis, Juno Diaz, Ahdaf Iswaif, and Alice Walker, among many others, PEN America did not take Israeli government funding for its 2017 World Voices Festival. This past July, over 80 theater artists, including many award-winning playwrights, signed a letter calling on Lincoln Center to cancel a theater production by 2 Israeli theater troupes because the performances were sponsored by the Israeli government and the troops were complicit in their government's repression. Alone, these actions may not seem significant, but carried out alongside numerous similar actions around the world, they signify a growing movement representing an increasing willingness by writers, artists, and other cultural workers to not only speak out against Israel's repression of Palestinian arts and culture, but to begin to hold Israel accountable for its violations of international law and Palestinian human rights.
Thank you so much, Rihem, for that context and inspiration to keep doing what we're doing. I'm Shalva. I coordinate the Artist Council of Jewish Voice for Peace, and it's been a real honor to co-organize this event with this amazing group of people and to have all of these really powerful voices in the room tonight. And I'm hoping that we can raise our voices together at the end of the evening, more instructions to follow, in support of a voice that the Israeli state is desperately trying to silence right now because of the bravery and resiliency and cultural resistance that she represents. Dorin Tatur, with whom you are probably many familiar, is being charged with incitement to violence and put on trial, literally for a poem. But she's just one of well over 400 Palestinians arrested in the last year or so for their expressions of resistance to the Israeli occupation over social media platforms. But her case is extremely important because of the implications that we'll have for future cases like it. So we have to be louder and stronger and more present than ever. So drawing on the incredible foundation of support that was garnered in last year's support campaign for her that did result in her house arrest being shifted so she could at least be with her family, we are launching a new and urgent call of support as her October 17th verdict date approaches. And part of that effort is a short, powerful, shareable social media video that we're producing, spotlighting the absurdity of her case and declaring the message loud and clear that poetry is not a crime and Jenin should be free. So how that's gonna work is that when this powerhouse panel has concluded, Riham and I are gonna share some really important announcements about ongoing and upcoming New York City specific actions that we should all plug into. And then we are going to follow the instructions of our amazing videographer and producer, who will set up a camera right there. And we will project the words on the screen. Anyone who doesn't want to be on camera will have a chance to step aside. And we will shoot, for the end of that video, all together raising our voices, declaring poetry is not a crime, Jenin should be free. So, to be continued, and more information to come. But now it is my profound pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for this evening. Sarah Schulman is a novelist, playwright, screenwriter, journalist, and AIDS historian. She is the author of 18 books, including Israel, Palestine, and the Queer International, and most recently, Conflict is Not Abuse, which includes an extensive analysis of the 2014 Israeli war on Gaza. Sarah is on the advisory board of Jewish Voice for Peace and is faculty advisor to Students for Justice in Palestine at the College of Staten Island, where she is a distinguished professor.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome, friends. The Palestine Solidarity Movement is a political movement. We do not all have the same experiences. We are not organized by experience. We do not all have the same identities. We're not organized by identities. But we do share the same values, and that is a commitment to international solidarity with the Palestinian people. And that's why we're here tonight. Now, we are in the midst of a complex but critical storm around the question of free speech and the definition of democracy in America, globally, and with respect to the international Palestine Solidarity Movement. All of us on this panel are supporters of boycott, divestment sanctions, which is a corrective to the lack of free speech, free movement, and self-determination for Palestinian people. Yet, ironically, in the topsy-turvy rhetoric of distortion that is consuming our public discourse, Palestine solidarity organizations and individuals are increasingly being subjected to legislation, executive orders, and campus restrictions that selectively repress our rights to organize, to conduct public forums such as this one, and to debate. Ironically, one of the terms of this repression is the manipulation of laws and rules that have been imposed under the rubric of what is called hate speech. Originally imagined to protect minorities and people whose power has been marginalized, hate speech restrictions are increasingly manipulated by supporters of the Israeli state, falsely conflating criticism of Israeli apartheid with anti-Semitic hate speech. Ironically, at the same time that Palestine solidarity movements are being suppressed by this deceitful use of hate speech structures, some corners of the progressive left are also applying hate speech rules in an effort to silence fascists and white supremacists and stop them from speaking. This creates a crisis of contradiction. Can the left call to repress the speech of fascists under the same rules that are being applied to suppress Palestine solidarity? To address some of these questions and raise others, we have three remarkable intellectuals, writers, and activists to address this. And each will speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Our first speaker is Radhika Sainath. She is a staff attorney at Palestine Legal, where she defends the civil and constitutional rights of students, professors, artists, and grassroots activists advocating for Palestinian freedom. And she is always there when you need her. Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks for that fantastic introduction, Sarah. Is this working? Can you guys hear me? Great. I am so honored to be here tonight on this all-female panel talking, all too rare, talking to this full house here at Verso. So thank you all for coming out tonight to hear us. I'm going to talk to you tonight about Palestine advocacy in the context that Sarah talked about of free speech and censorship that we're experiencing in this moment here in the United States. Can you see my slides? Oh. Slides up? Okay. Going back. So the organization that I work for, Palestine Legal, supports and defends the rights of civil and constitutional rights of activists in this country who speak out for Palestinian freedom. And 2 years ago, we, together with the Center for Constitutional Rights, put out a report, a groundbreaking report called The Palestine Exception to Free Speech. And I'm not going to go over the dozens of examples that we documented, but basically the report talks about and documents how advocates who speak out for Palestinian rights in this country are censored, suppressed, punished, or otherwise threatened because of their principled stance for Palestinian human rights. And in a 2-year period, Palestine Legal responded to 650 incidents of suppression in this country. And really, that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's what people contact us about. There's so much more going on beneath the waters. And the vast majority of these incidents that we've responded to target students and scholars. So our report goes into a lot of detail. There's over 1,000 footnotes on the various tactics that Israel advocacy groups use to suppress speech in this country. But I'm going to really just focus on one of these tactics here today, and Sarah gave a little intro on that, and that's how false accusations of anti-Semitism, and by that I mean criticizing the state of Israel or standing up for Palestinian human rights, how these kinds of false accusations are being levied strategically against activists, students, and scholars in order to censor speech. And I'm going to go back a couple of years to an incident that happened uptown at Barnard, where Columbia Students for Justice in Palestine applied to put a banner up over Barnard Hall in the tradition that student groups have been doing for decades. And the group crossed all their T's, dotted all their I's. They filled out the paperwork. They got the canvas from the school. They hand-painted this canvas with the message, "Stand for Justice, Stand for Palestine," as you can see up there, and turned it over to Columbia University facilities, who hung the banner up. And overnight, a campaign was launched by Students Supporting Israel against this banner, saying that the banner threatened them and they made students feel unsafe, that it was hateful, that it singled out Jews, that it caused grave feelings of distress, that these, this handful of words symbolically denied the Jewish people a right to statehood. It said that the banner had to be taken down in order to ensure that people feel comfortable walking around on Barnard campus. So at the end of the day, unfortunately, the banner was removed overnight, and it was never put back up. And Palestine Legal and the Center for Constitutional Rights wrote Barnard College saying that this was viewpoint discrimination, that political banners had hung for years in this very spot, and Barnard claimed that it was, had been reassessing its banner policy and had decided to not allow banners anymore, which is why they took the banners down in the dead of the night. No one bought it, but unfortunately, that's their banner policy. No students are allowed to hang banners there anymore. So that reflects, one type of suppression that we've seen, and unfortunately, we did not win on that one. Going across the country to the University of California, Berkeley, my alma mater, last year, a course on Palestine called Palestine: A Settler Colonial Analysis was censored after Israel advocacy groups complained. It was actually suspended mid-semester. And this was a one-unit class under the Democratizing Cal initiative, or it's called the DeCal class, that is this incredible initiative that Berkeley had, where students who are really ambitious and interested can teach a course on an area of their interest. And they take a course on how to teach the course. They work really closely with a professor on the syllabus. It's hosted by a department. In this case, it was the Ethnic Studies Department. And here you have Palestinian American senior Berkeley student Paul Hudway, who was really excited in teaching this class. And again, he filled out all the paperwork properly. He started the class. And this is just 2 pages of the syllabus. It's really serious. It documents, goes through the whole history of Palestine, for over 100 years. Not the whole history, but the recent history. And, again, this is just a 1-unit class. So he, treated this very, very seriously. And his reading list included Israeli and Palestinian scholars. And, 43 Israeli advocacy groups complained, and they engaged in a letter writing campaign. They said that this class was political indoctrination, that it meets our government's criteria for anti-Semitism, that it was intended to indoctrinate students to hate the Jewish state. They said it was biased. They said it was anti-Zionist. They said that guest speakers publicly support BDS. In a very McCarthyite fashion, they said that the student instructor is an active member of Students for Justice in Palestine. He wasn't, but that shouldn't matter, obviously. So, the class was suspended mid-semester, and the chancellor's office, in response to the group that organized this campaign, Amcha, mirrored a lot of their language. And they said that, oh yeah, the course, espouses a single political viewpoint, appears to offer a forum for political organizing. It said that UC Berkeley will continue to confront intolerance and bias. Randomly, it bragged about a kosher dining hall and at Berkeley, and also says that it's taking this unprecedented step to look at Jewish student life on campus. Now, mind you, as I said, there's students teach a lot of these 1-unit classes. Other courses at the time that were not deemed political or one-sided, Marxism and its discontents, no pro-capitalist viewpoints in that class. Filmmaking for activists, it has the word activist in its title, and it was not deemed political. Cop Watch, human trafficking, no pro-trafficking viewpoints on that syllabus. So, I could go on and on. And then also, again, these are supposed to be like fun classes for students. They're 1 unit that, and so you also had classes on like Game of Thrones and Harry Potter and, Hunger Games and Pokemon. So the course was suspended mid-semester, and after Palestine Legal wrote Berkeley and said, hey, this is a violation of the First Amendment, they reinstated the class. But, the student, was pilloried in the media, from the Israeli media to, others who said that he was, trying to, was engaged in this campaign of hate, that he was trying to wipe Israel off the map, he couldn't sleep. It was really hard for him emotionally to have to go through this. And he wasn't even informed directly from his school that his course is being suspended. He heard about it through Israeli Channel 10. So, in some ways it was a victory, but in other ways you can really see the chilling effect, because the next time a Palestinian American student wants to teach a class, he or she's gonna think twice, right, about the hardship that they might encounter just for trying to do what everyone else is doing. So that's really unfortunate. And I'm gonna end it with just one last example of how Israel advocacy groups are trying to censor speech supporting Palestinian rights, and that's by using Title VI discrimination threats and complaints. At least 6 meritless complaints have been filed that we're aware of, alleging that criticism of Israel on campus creates a hostile environment for Jewish students. And Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination by institutions that receive federal funding. And a school can lose its federal funding if it acts in a way that's clearly unreasonable, resulting in the denial of a student's educational opportunities. So the kinds of conduct and speech that are complained about, here's a few things that we've seen in Title VI complaints and in letters to universities threatening Title VI complaints. Stuff like saying that Israel is an apartheid state, or stickers equating Zionism with racism, calling for a boycott of Israel, carrying signs that say #FreePalestine. Other things, depictions of a kafia, that was an accusation levied at CUNY Staten Island, where Sarah Schulman teaches. Mock checkpoints, screening on Occupation 101 video, events featuring a Nakba survivor and a Holocaust survivor. These are just a few things. The list goes on and on. So fortunately, the Department of Education, and this is Obama's Department of Education, said that all of these kinds of events constituted expressions on matters of public concern directed to the university community and did not constitute actionable harassment. So the DOE threw these out, and they said, hey, in the university environment, exposure to such robust and discordant expressions, even when personally offensive and hurtful, is a circumstance that a reasonable student in higher education may experience. So again, we've been winning these. However, I just want to say that Kenneth Marcus, who's the president of the Brandeis Center, one of the groups that has been using this Title VI strategy as a strategy to censor speech and suppress speech on college campuses that's critical of Israel, has been really clear that even when they lose, they win, because nobody wants a Title VI investigation at their school. Students don't want to deal with this either. Students at CUNY had to endure a 6-month-long investigation, which completely found in their favor, but it's still really exhausting, especially for working class students who maybe also have to work and teach and have to juggle various things, to also have to be to testify in front of a task force and to do all these kinds of things is really, really burdensome. So, these kinds of attacks do have a chilling effect. They limit debate, they can ruin reputations. They're especially hard on Arab students, Muslim students, Palestinian students, other students of color. So at the end of the day, even when we're winning, it can be hard on some student groups. So I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Radhika. And our next speaker, Aja Monet, is an American contemporary poet, writer, lyricist, and activist of Cuban-Jamaican descent from Brooklyn. She is a former New Eurekan Grand Slam champion, people, and has been active with Say Her Name, The Dreamers, and recently returned from a delegation to Palestine. And if you're lucky, like me, you can get her new book. My mother was a freedom fighter right over there, and she will sign it for you. Welcome, Aja.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to Verso Books. Thank you to Adalah. Thank you to JVP. Just thank you for making this space. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm going to try to keep my ideas and things coordinated, hopefully. If they make no sense, just don't judge me. Some days are better than others. I wanted to begin by just honoring my own personal story, being from Brooklyn, New York, and how I became aware of the Palestinian struggle. Should probably turn that off. I started in an organization called Urban Word NYC, which is a young organization for inner city kids to provide performance, poetry opportunities, workshops. And I met a young woman by the name of Tahani Salah, who became one of my dear friends, collaborators, and comrades. And it was poetry that politicized me and made me aware of the world that I could not experience or perhaps travel to. And so I'm gonna begin with a little quote from June Jordan, who is probably, has been the most active and vocal Black female poet, writer, artist, activist on the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and has been for a very long time. I'm going to share some notes, and a little bit about the trip that we took and why I'm here and all that. But the core of what I wanted to bring into the conversation was what is solidarity, and how do we as Black people, Black Americans, the diaspora, demonstrate and show up and start to define and question what solidarity is and looks like. And we are also pushing, within the last few months, we've been pushing and trying to challenge the word solidarity. And I imagine there's people in here who are writers or lovers of writers. Words are they're things, they have spirits, they carry things. And so we've been trying to find ways to develop new language for what we hope to do and how we hope to demonstrate what we're doing. And so in our most recent delegation, there was an artist who was a part of our delegation by the name of Vic Mensa, who's from a rapper from South Side of Chicago, and he coined the term in a Bedouin camp called solidarity. And so we've been playing with, well, how do we really show what that is? Not just saying I'm here and, you know, I stand for you and I wear a keffiyeh every now and then. But what are the risks and what are the actions we take and how do we assert our humanity in those actions? June Jordan talks about solidarity as the unity of resistance to hatred. She says, resistance is against, meanwhile, I am moving on an irrepressible wish that all of us will build that circle of our common safety that all of us deserve. And who will join this standing up? And the ones who stood without sweet company will sing and give and bring back into the mountains, and if necessary, even under the sea, we are the ones we have been waiting for. One of the things that June Jordan and a lot of poets and women of color were really trying to access in the time that they were writing, especially in the third wave feminism, particularly the third world press, you know, movement that women were engaging with, was how do we show up and what are the ways that performance poetry, art, creating, dignifies us? How do we tell counter narratives? How do we reshape who we are when there's a master narrative that constantly tells who women are, what Black people are doing in the world? And so what was seen as entertainment, what has often been exploited in our country of Black struggle and suffering as entertainment for the rest of the world to indulge in, our blues, our jazz, all those things, and then became monetized, was actually a praxis of liberation. It was the way in which we demonstrated our dignity. We demonstrated what we stood for. One of the things that Gloria Anzal-Zua talks about is a shaman witness ritual, the spoken word activism. And I want to encourage all of you tonight that perhaps you are engaging in that moment right in this very second. And what they were trying to encourage was that there would be more engaged witnessing, that audience members, participants, community members were not just sitting there listening to the struggles of other people or listening to the narrative of us up here, et cetera, but that the only way what we're doing means or makes any difference is if you actually are actively listening. And that means writing down words, new ideas, exploring what in you feels disrupted by things that you hear that challenge your convictions. You know, how do we examine our convictions? How do we get to the place that we claim to be human? So that's a little bit of the narrative that I've grown up being inspired by. That's what educated me, and especially also the Cuban, Jamaican aspect of my life, knowing about the ways in which the diaspora has always seen the role of art, culture, the performance, ritual, that all these things were ways that we showed and demonstrated and fought back. And you know, the way in which people are enamored by the performance of art and yet don't really know what actually artists are doing. And so if you look at history, you see that we have always used art and culture as a means of liberatory practice, a means of speaking out against, quote unquote, those that would have our spirits remain silent. And so if something in you ever is called to fight oppression, resistance, et cetera, it brings you to write a poem, it brings you to make a song, it brings you to dance, stomp your feet and say this isn't right. And that's what marching and protesting is. And so fast forward a little bit, I was invited by an artist by the name of Maytha Al-Hassan to come to Palestine with the Dream Defenders delegation. And the Dream Defenders started this delegation because a brother who was a part of founder and organizer by the name of Ahmed Abuznaid, he saw the correlations between the work he was doing defending our brothers and sisters here and the ways in which state violence perpetuates itself and criminalizes and destroys the image of Black and brown people. He saw the same acts of violence in his homeland, and his dream was that someday Black folks could come to see what, in fact, his people are and have endured. And not just to tell the story, but how do we become engaged witnesses? And this is, I'll keep bringing this up in terms of solidarity or quote unquote solidarity. So how do we not just go and be a tourist, right? How do we do something that is going to show that we're trying to shift narrative, we're trying to shift the stigma around Palestine? There was a time, I know right before we went on our first delegation, which was in 2015, when we couldn't even say the word Palestine in public, you know, and let alone the media, et cetera. There was so much fear and paranoia around the phrase, you know, that somehow that was automatically a reason to therein be in opposition to a Jewish person, so to speak. And yet we knew that wasn't true, right? We knew that wasn't the full story. So in moving along, one of the things that I recently did after our first delegation, which was in 2015, we did a demonstration. Some of you can look it up online, which was, quote unquote, we called it a flash mob. I don't know if it was really a flash mob. That's what we called it, just to kind of make sense of what we was trying to do. We had learned Dabka by a group of young girls at Shoruk, a Deheshe refugee camp in Bethlehem, and we was like, this is dope. Like, we need to figure out how to demonstrate beyond us just taking pictures and being here and telling the story, that we've not just come to watch, but we've come to learn, to act, to practice, to listen, to radically listen, and to see what was it of Palestinians that they needed from us in order for us to help their cause. And the most consistent thing was, this isn't a Palestinian issue, that this was an international issue. This was an issue of foreigners who had come in, and much like the indigenous folks who've gone through the same here in the States and genocide, that this was an act of others coming from the outside. And so what it would take folks from the outside organizing themselves, undoing their fucked upness. And so we had, excuse me, and so we had the task of coming back home and trying to recognize that if we were going to fight oppression, if we were going to fight white supremacy, if we were going to fight this monstrous country, that we could not see ourselves outside of the struggle of the Palestinian people, and that solidarity could not be transactional. That solidarity had to be something beyond a capitalist benefit of one over the other. That solidarity meant risk, that it meant taking and saying things that people didn't want to hear, that it meant being yelled at, it meant being things thrown at you. It meant everything we know as Black people in this country resistance stands for. And one of the biggest things that was transformative for me was, you know, the narrative that we heard about the variation between violence and nonviolence. Because, you know, Black folks, we all deal with that question. What's violent, what's nonviolent? You know, when you grow up in American schools, you learn history tells you that it's either Malcolm X or Martin Luther King. You got to choose what side you on. And we met with some Palestinian activists in Ramallah, and one of the things they said to us, you know, what was it? There wasn't a word for nonviolence, right, up until very recently. And so to them, they were so confused by like this need to make a distinction between the two. And one of these sisters, dope, by the way, I elevate all the Palestinian sisters. They are fucking incredible. They're the epicenter of revolution and resistance in Palestine. But one of the things the sister said was, if a foot is on your neck, you know, you got to do everything you can to get that foot off your neck, right? At one point, you're like, please get the foot off my neck, please, please, please. Then there's a moment you start to say, hey, you got to get that fucking foot off my neck. And then at some point, you're starting to reach around you to see what you can get to try to take that foot off your neck. And if at some point, this is where I'll probably try to end, if at some point you, the person watching and witnessing, does not help the person who has the foot on their neck get the foot off their neck, you have no right to talk about how they ought to resist the foot on their neck. It is not your job to tell somebody how to resist. So that means it's irrelevant whether or not you agree someone should fight violently or non-violently. The issue is that Palestinian people have a foot on their neck. And it would take forever for me to go through all the notes and all the things I wrote down to fully describe to you the horror of what is taking place in Palestine with the state of Israel. But I tried to be very clear about where my critique lies and where my solidarity lies, which is I'm not here for a transaction. I'm not here because this does me well. I'm here because I stand against oppression anywhere. And that means anywhere, you know? And so if I have the ability to say, this is, you know, Palestinians don't, in the conversations we have never said, oh, hey, you know, I'm into politics and I believe in this solution or this solution. One sister told us, another powerful, amazing sister, she said, Farouz, she said, with Grassroots Jerusalem, she said, we said, oh, well, what do you want? What do Palestinian people want? What are the things that you feel? And she said, you know what, I can give two fucks about a two-state solution. I'm not here to talk politics. I'm here to remain a human, to be treated as a human, to have integrity, to have decency, to have protection under the law, to have what you claim to be a democracy, which is not. And so what are the ways in which I assert my humanity, you know? In the end, our goal is to tell new, profound stories. How do we shift the stories that are told and the ways in which Palestinian people have been silenced? And in this particular last delegation, we have a few of the delegates here. Jadel, who's an Afro-Cuban artist. We have Brittany King over there, who's a Dream Defender organizer. We have Mahdi over here, who's a part of one of the dopest, illest groups from hip hop. You know, I always say Digital Planets, but it's actually Digital Planets, so I'm just off. But what we were able to do and what's been difficult, this is what I'll say and here, what's been the challenge is how do we counter the narratives that most people hear about Palestine. So a lot of my conversation and my work has been sharing new stories, being in conversation with people that don't know very much about what's happening, and how do we tell, share art, share cultures. How do I send you links that show you, okay, this is the humanity of Palestinian people in spite of the savagery that the state of Israel and Zionist propaganda would like to show about Palestinians. And so art and culture has been the way that has always elevated the spiritual need of the people, and we need to be telling and sharing more of that art and culture. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Aja. Suzanne Abulhawa is a novelist, poet, and activist. She's also the founder of Playgrounds for Palestine, mother of one awesome daughter, one loving dog, and two bad cats. She's also a major American writer. This book, Mornings in Jenin, has been translated into 26 languages. I have novelist envy, 26 languages. And her new book, The Blue Between Sky and Water, is awesome. And you can get copies of both books over there, and Susan can sign them for you. Thank you. Welcome.
So I feel really blessed to be on this panel with such powerful women. We tried to coordinate, you know, who was going to cover what, but it didn't work out. But you know, it's as if we did, because I'm actually going to be jumping off of both of my sisters here. But I want to say first, I want to reiterate what Aja was saying about solidarity. I love that term. I'm going to use it from now on. It should be reciprocal, and I think this kind of reciprocal and mutual solidarity between liberation of Palestinians and the liberation of Black America reinforce each other, and it makes us all the more powerful. So what I'm going to try and do in the limited time I have is to touch on three things. First of all, I want to talk about the idea of narrative as an integral part of oppression, as it is an integral part of resistance to oppression. And I'm going to touch on how Israel works to control the narrative within its own population, and how it works to control the narrative outside of its borders, in particular in the United States. So I'm not a particularly dynamic speaker, so I'm really just going to read from my notes here. So when we talk about colonial projects that expel, exploit, subjugate, or enslave another people, we often conjure images of violence and cruelty because we understand force as a principal mechanism by which colonialism is implemented. Conquest and subjugation do indeed require the use of force, but there's another equally important layer that allows colonial projects to subsist and even to flourish. This happens by creating an explicit narrative that positions the colonizer as a force of good, a force of enlightenment, of progress, and it positions the colonized or the chained as savage, as cruel, irrational, inherently violent, backward, stupid, etc. And once a new narrative is planted, it becomes a powerful, living, changing thing. It digs roots into the space around it, into the minds of the colonized. And that internalized narrative within the colonized is what reinforces and maintains colonial projects. At a minimum, they have to believe that they are powerless before their colonizers. Often, it's a more insidious internal dialogue of intellectual inferiority, of ugliness, unworthiness, of brokenness. And instilling this sense of powerlessness, of fear, of unpredictability, inferiority, has to start early with the younger generation. And this has been one reason why Israel has, since its inception, targeted Palestinian children in schools, school raids, bombings, regular and random and constant harassment, night raids. This is the reason, too, that colonizers deployed thousands of missionaries and set up missionary schools throughout Africa. It made it easy to instill a narrative of inferiority, of a preordained fate, of a powerlessness before an omnipotent white God. So this is an old script that's recycled in different places and different times. So it reasons then that anything that upsets the prevailing narrative becomes an existential threat to a colonial project. And this is where the old adage of the pen is mightier than the sword comes from. This is something that Frantz Fanon wrote about. He talked about re-narration by the oppressed and how the telling of our lived experiences become acts of decolonization in themselves. So, as a settler colonial nation, Israel is terrified of losing control of the narrative. They're terrified of native voices that do not relinquish their power. And that's why they have multiple layers of censorship within their own country. For example, Israel's military has the power to censor any media articles or news reports. Every journalist working within Israel has to get approval and accreditation from the Israeli press office. They have so-called anti-hate or anti-incitement laws that criminalize free speech. One of the most high-profile cases of criminalized speech is the case of Darin Tatur, whom Shalva talked about already. So I'm not going to go into her case too much, but I'm just going to add two details that Shalva missed. One is that her ordeal has been going on for 2 years. She was arrested in October of 2015. She was arrested in a night raid. They just, barged into her home at 4 o'clock in the morning. And another thing is that after they arrested her and charged her, they added another charge of commemorating the massacre at Kufr Qasim. Kufr Qasim the massacre was an incident when Israeli soldiers killed 49 Palestinian civilians at close range because they were breaking curfew unbeknownst to them. There were 23 children in that group and one pregnant woman. And so nothing happened really to the soldiers who murdered those people, but Jenin is charged with commemorating their memory. So there are many examples of this sort of silencing within Israel, and of course, this doesn't include the assassinations of intellectuals like Ghassan Kanafani and others. And obviously, they have more power to control the narrative within their own borders, where they have consolidated state power. But controlling the narrative abroad is just as important to the survival of their settler colonial enterprise. And it's a bit trickier to censor voices in other countries, especially in societies where there are mechanisms and institutions that work to protect individual liberties like free speech. like my sister Radhika here. So Israel works in a lot of ways to control the narrative abroad, especially in the United States. So for starters, they work through diplomatic missions, about 10 of them situated throughout major cities in the US. They have several very highly paid PR firms, and a very large network of organized volunteers. And all of these arms work in tandem to basically create relationships with editors and producers to influence the content of the news and the information that we get. And lately, this has been especially true when it comes to matters regarding BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign. And so the flip side of this is silencing dissent. And you've heard a lot of the tactics that are employed throughout campuses. And another way that they've been successful at this has been to push through Congress laws that enable them to target specific individuals and that aren't, they sort of circumvent the First Amendment. And these laws are pushed through almost always after heightened public fear, after acts of terrorism. So for example, after the Oklahoma City bombing, which was perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh, a white supremacist, the Israeli lobby effectively helped push through legislation that became known as the Secret Evidence Act, which allows U.S. authorities to arrest, detain, and deport lawful U.S. residents in a separate court system and under secret evidence that the defendants' lawyers or their family, no one's allowed to see. And even though this legislation was ostensibly enacted as a reaction to terrorism by a white guy, the overwhelming majority of the targets of that legislation were Arabs and Muslims who were rounded up en masse, detained, and deported. My father was one of them. Another way is by ensuring that their enemies, like Hamas, are listed as terrorist organizations. And this enables the prosecution of individuals and organizations in the United States under various anti-terrorism laws for expressing support for groups or providing humanitarian aid to Palestinians living in Gaza, for example, whether or not they support Hamas. Noteworthy cases of this are of Sami al-Arian, who was a prominent Palestinian civil rights activist. He was a professor. He was put through the ringer, really basically for being an outspoken and effective critic of Israel. And the other example is of the Holy Land Five, who ran the Holy Land Foundation, which provided charitable aid all over the world, and especially to Gaza, which is what was their downfall. But now, what can they do about the growing popularity of BDS? So, of course, the boycott has real financial, material effects on Israel, but maybe not to the extent that we want it to be now. What BDS is really effective at now is that it's upending Israel's prevailing colonial narrative of an enlightened civilization that's combating a regressive group of terrorists. So BDS is often seen as a tactic or as a movement. I really see it as something a little bit bigger. I see it as a landscape with a kind of corrective story that gives a kind of popular new narrative that allows people from all over the world to engage in a national liberation struggle of an oppressed indigenous colonized society. So seeing this through Israel's eyes, I imagine it's very terrifying to them and hugely threatening, precisely because they really cannot offer a convincing counter-narrative. It's really hard to sell their desire for an ethno-religious purity. It's hard to sell apartheid. The only thing that they have at their disposal to do is to fall back on old methods of censorship, criminalization, punishment of speech that is counter to their narrative. What this means is that they don't have any real power with ordinary people, with the masses. Their power is concentrated with the political elite, and that's where they've had to put all of their efforts, which is currently being translated into various anti-BDS laws that have passed many state legislatures. I think we're at 21 states now, that work to punish companies, institutions, and individuals that sign on to BDS. And of course, one of the driving arguments, as my sister said, is the conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And in fact, AIPAC actually helped push through Congress the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which basically officially changed the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel and criticisms of Zionism. And this allows people like us to be investigated for civil rights violations. And so now, under the guise of wanting to curtail the rise of the so-called alt-right and in the wake of what happened in Charlottesville, they are pushing for anti-hate speech laws, as we've already heard. And it's frightening that a lot of people on the left think this is a good idea. But I think that these kinds of reactive measures, just like the Secret Evidence Act, which are, put in place supposedly to address white violence, really rarely touch white people, and we will be the targets of any kind of legislation that's meant to curtail speech, period. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. So before we open it up for questions and discussion, I would just like to pose 3 questions and give you the choice of answering whichever one you think is most relevant or just ignoring them. So here are my 3 questions. One is, how do we keep the right from owning the free speech discourse? Question number 2. We know that attacks on BDS show that we are being effective, but exactly how effective are we? And 3, what strategic changes would you like to see in the Palestine solidarity movement?
Can you repeat? I'm trying to
Yes.
take notes.
The first question is, how do we keep the right from owning the free speech discourse? The second is, in what concrete ways is BDS being effective? And the third is, what strategic changes would you like to see in the Palestine solidarity movement? So any of those that either any of you feel like responding to? Obviously, I didn't give them the questions in advance.
Okay. I mean, I can touch. I don't really know.
Go for it.
Okay, so how to keep the right from owning the free? I mean, I don't even really think this is something we. It's not something that I think I really concern myself with. I think that it's important to. Number one, as I've already said, is to insist on is to stand against measures to curtail free speech, because it really is a tool that it's invaluable for us, and we would be targeted for curtailment of it. BDS affected in concrete ways. I mean, I think I kind of covered that. On the good side, though, I think that Israel is kind of doing a lot of the legwork for us in terms of publicizing BDS, and they're making such a stink about it, and people who've never heard of BDS are introduced to it suddenly, and So I kind of like how scared they're running. I mean, they're investing a lot of money into countering us, and it seems to keep backfiring. I mean, they have a couple of successes here and there, but I don't even think it's, yeah. I mean, they're terrified, and rightfully so. Strategic changes in Palestine solidarity. I think in Palestine, in our movement, I mean, I can't. I think as a Palestinian, one of the things, and I kind of touched on this, is for us to be as aware of other struggles as other struggles are aware of us. I think it's really easy to get sort of caught up in our own pain, in our own victimhood, but one of the things that has been really empowering to me as a writer, as a woman, as an activist, as a human being, is recognition of parallel struggles, parallel pains and wounds, and how much they are actually enmeshed together in their similarities and in their histories and so forth. So for me, that has been a really enriching and empowering thing, and I think there's never have enough awareness and reciprocal solidarity. So,
Okay, wonderful.
there you go.
Thank you so much.
To the first question, I'm not really interested in keeping anyone from doing anything. Like, I'm all about helping people be their best selves. I think whatever I can do to empower someone to, like, be better, that's what I'm focused on. I think we got to where we are with number 45 and the craziness, because I think all of us were in our little silos believing we was all right, and we didn't really spend enough time challenging our own convictions, and we don't always listen. The left doesn't always listen because it's so painful to hear the right sometimes. You like, dang. But we have a lot to learn in how to not necessarily keep anyone from doing whatever, but I think in how to tell the stories we want to hear, and how to share the things and promote the things we want to hear. And so I think I'm more concerned with difficult conversations, things we don't like. I've had a lot of speaking engagements where, some crazy Zionist will yell at me and tell me, it's Israel, it's not Palestine, just crazy stuff. And I'm just like, wow, like the level of conviction is actually intriguing to me. So I'm really interested in, like, just as much as I am in them and how crazy they are, how right-wing, conservative, white folks, believe the crap they believe, and what are the things that help perpetuate that, and how do we challenge that? And before I, try to tell somebody they are wrong or what they should or shouldn't be doing, I think I got to create more space for us to do what's right. And so I'm interested in, I have one of my best friends who's grew up Zionist, and we went to Sarah Lawrence College together, which has some Zionist folks up in there. And I didn't know what it was at the time. I knew it was fucked up, but I didn't know what it was at the time. And we have difficult conversations with each other, and I've learned a lot about how to talk about Palestine by talking to her, and what her upbringing was and what her conditioning was. And the biggest thing that scares me about the convictions that people have is really, like, Black folks have been through a lot. The diaspora of Black African people has been through so much that we have to be very careful before we become, quote unquote, the oppressor. I'm not interested in perpetuating the problem. I'm not interested in being like, we're gonna show each other how evil we could be. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in what are the ways that I can assert my humanity? What are the ways that I can reimagine our performance of freedom and equality and all these things together? And how can we practice that? How can we create engaged conversations? Engaged witnessing is what I keep going back to. And so if I want these people to learn something, if I need folks to start challenging their tax dollars and where it's going, and challenging the state of Israel, then I have to be willing to talk to them and see what got them to think the way they do in the first place. But that doesn't mean I'm gonna deal with all the fuckery all the time. So there's like a level, you know, there's a balance. Like, you do what you can. The second thing, how is BDS effective? I mean, the really interesting thing for me about BDS is basically, you know, it's like what we were trying to do in the 60s, like on steroids. Like, it's so profound because we haven't, as Black people, been able to really organize around boycotting because we have been so much trying to become a part of the system and be seen as human and being seen as equal and being seen as intelligent and being seen as all these things that we know we are, and yet the world keeps telling us we're not, and definitely the state of America tells us we're not. And so what's messed us up is how do we have a critique of capitalism? And one of the things BDS really focuses on is money. They talk about money. They don't talk about ethics or their religious beliefs or none of that. They go straight to the money. They go to where the evil is and how the evil's perpetuated and what it's really been supported by, which is money. And that's why they're hurting so bad, you know, because they love their money, you know. And I'm saying they as in white supremacists, patriarchal they, all right? As in, to use Khaled, they, you know, the ambiguous they. So one of the things that's effective is that, and another thing is, you know, apartheid is not a matter of opinion, is something Omar Barghouti said. He talked about, you know, it's divine, it's systemic oppression, it's legalized, it's institutionalized. So we're not targeting individuals. We're not in the business, which America loves to do. We're not in the business of the spectacle of celebrity and how we could target this one individual to get what we think we need and feel good about ourselves and say, oh yeah, we made you look real bad. We're interested in targeting institutions. We're interested in targeting systemic violence. And that's what we have to talk about when we talk about Israel. We have to talk about the state of Israel. I don't care if you're Jewish. I don't care if you believe in the state. I don't care what your parents went through. I don't care none of that. At this current moment, we have to deal with what Palestinian people are facing, what Black people are facing due to state-sanctioned violence. And so the focus of this is why BDS is so effective and important. And I think what we have been trying to learn from this is how do we stop artists? How do we stop influential people? How do we stop people who the young people are listening to, that people are watching and caring about? How do we get them educated? How do we get them politicized? How do we get people to make wise decisions about what they're posting on their social media and what they're sharing with each other and what new stories we're telling? We have to create more films. We have to create more songs. We have to create more art. You know, one of the things we talked about was the politicizing of the wall and how artists were challenged about what the wall could do or couldn't do after 2004, and people took to the wall. And then, you know, there was also the critique of, well, we don't want to beautify the wall. But one of the conversations we have as Black people with Palestinians is like graffiti has always been about not just beautifying our horror or the gentrification, little ghettos they gave us, or whatever. It's also about maintaining our dignity, telling messages, protests. How do we get the community aware and rallying people around these issues? And so BDS has been very critical in helping to do that. And solidarity, like BDS can't survive without solidarity. You know, that's the only way BDS will continue to survive. It needs the Alice Walker to pull her books out. It needs the Alicia Keys to not perform, even though she did. It needs the Lauryn Hill to not go, you know. And that's what we've been doing. Vic Mensa, you know, he has, for better or worse, you know, he has to deal with the industry. He's signed to Rock Nation. He has a big name. And we dealt with a lot of challenges about, well, how do we show up for him knowing he's going to go out there and speak and talk about or even share or post something about Palestine, knowing what he's facing and knowing what are the things that he's going to be challenged by. So one of our challenges as we do solidarity is how do we also elevate, how does IMU, how does all these other organizations, Adalah, how do we show up for people when they take the risk and when they start to lose money, lose institutional funding, et cetera? It's the same as happened with Dream Defenders. Right now, Dream Defenders is on the brink of extinction because of the stance it has taken against the state of Israel. And so one of the things we're trying to find is the money, you know? It's really the money. So I think BDS has done a really good job of that, and that's a way to kind of segue to how we need more solidarity. Sorry, that was long.
I'm I'm really glad you asked that first question, Sarah, because I think there is this narrative being advanced right now, especially in the mainstream media, that the right cares about free speech and the leftists want to shut down free speech. And I think that's completely false. And we've seen this over and over again, where really you have the right, you have liberals, you have even progressive Zionists who over and over again are trying to shut down speech supporting Palestinian rights. And I think Sarah really and Susan really put it beautifully in saying in talking about the power and the concentration of power within elites. And I think it's really elites of pretty much all, well, on the spectrum of political persuasions that are really trying to censor speech here on this issue. And you can really see this at Berkeley recently, where there was an article, I believe it was in the New York Times, and there's a free speech week that's coming up, where you have every former official in the Trump administration and it seems like neo-Nazi speaking at Berkeley. And there's this idea that like Berkeley, it's this liberal bastion, and they're trying to shut down the right from talking. And Berkeley admitted to letting deadlines slide when it came to allowing some of these speakers to come speak on campus. But those deadlines were not allowed to slide when it comes to Palestine activists who fill out all their paperwork on time and who have their courses suspended, or can't get a room, or have to get their paperwork lost over and over and over again. So you really do see administrations bending over backwards in some cases to allow these white supremacists to speak. But when it comes to speech supporting Palestinian rights, not so much. So I think that's a really false narrative, and I think it's really important that we get our narrative out there about what's happening. And then as far as how effective BDS is, I hope my presentation wasn't too depressing. I think I cut out all of the uplifting slides to try to squeeze it down to 10 minutes. But I just want to say that we wouldn't be seeing some of these things that I've been talking about if BDS and the movement to support Palestinian rights wasn't so effective. And I really mean this, and especially on college campuses, because that is really where anti-Zionists, where Zionists and people against Palestinian rights are really trying to fight speech and stop the discourse and stop the debate from happening. We've seen over 60 bills trying to outlaw BDS introduced over the past few years. 21 have passed. That's incredible, and you can say that's depressing, but you can also see where all the money is going and the fear there, because they should be scared, because if BDS, if we weren't winning and if we weren't changing the discourse, they wouldn't be fighting it so hard.
Okay, so let's open it up to you. Questions, comments. There are people with microphones. They will decide who's going to ask.
I thought your second question about BDS was how effective are the attacks on BDS?
No, how effective is BDS itself?
Hi, Sarah. I was wondering, to
Who
what
are you, by the way?
My name's Gunnar.
Gunnar,
I
okay.
was one of Radhika's clients in the SJP chapter at Fordham University.
Oh, okay. Yay
yeah.
for you guys.
Sarah, I was wondering, to what extent do you think that the justifications for the hundreds of instances of Palestine repression on college campuses that Radhika has documented, namely that the promotion of anti-Zionist politics create unsafe spaces for Jewish students, are an example of the arguments in your book, Conflict is Not Abuse?
Oh, that's too complicated for 3 minutes. It's, what my book is about is how when people in power claim that they're being victimized because somebody else is telling the truth about them. And that is the definition of the behavior of the Israeli state. And it's also our president who tells us every day what a victim he is, especially when someone tells the truth about what he's doing. So in that way, I think, it's a classic example. But thank you for the question. And thanks for all your work at Fordham.
Thank you very much for this. So my name is Corinne, and I'm from Israel. And I've been an activist in Israel for long parts of my youth, and for Palestinian rights, against the occupation. And then when I came here, and now, throughout those years, I was waiting for Boycott to happen as an activist, because it was obvious that it should happen, and it didn't. It was like the 90s, the 20s, the 2000s. And then when it did happen, I suddenly felt that I'm outside of it, that I can't really, as an Israeli, be part of it. And I wonder why. And I think the reason I feel that is that there is a problem of an ongoing complicity, because I'm still, I grew up with the Israeli education system. I got married within the Israeli, government institutions that marry people, and Jews even, and everybody in Israel. I still have connections there that are very deep.
Do you have a question?
So my question is, how do you, it's maybe not even for you, but for maybe other people here in the audience, how do people handle this and still be active or involved in Boycott?
How to handle what?
An ongoing condition of complicity that, you experience being an Israeli, and also how can Israelis be part of this movement?
Well, how many people here know about Boycott from within? Okay, so there is a movement within Israel of Israeli citizens who support the boycott. Does anyone want to respond here? Okay.
Well, I'll just say, thanks for speaking up. I just feel, the way I feel listening to you is how I feel when white Americans be like, how can we help the black cause, And sometimes it's just a really tiring and exhausting question, because you wonder, like, do you see what's going on? Any day you wake up, you can do something that can make a difference, Every day that you have a breath, you can do something to challenge the state of Israel. It don't matter where it begins. It can begin talking to your family, could begin organizing against people going back to the right of return, or all that other stuff. There's so many ways to enter the movement and be a part of Palestinian rights to exist. And I think that it's just about, where do you want to begin, what risks are you willing to take, and what sacrifices are you willing to make in order to really stand for what you're claiming to stand for. So I encourage you to continue to fight whatever fight you feel you need to fight in yourself, but also to do the work, do the damn work. We don't, Palestinians don't need to be doing all the damn work. You need to be organizing your folks doing the work. So I always say, if you could throw a party, if you could speak, show up to a rally, there's so many ways we can get folks to organize. And we need folks organizing their fucked up hatred for other people to be healed and not perpetuated and addressed. So whatever you can do it, please. We need it.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Thank you, Aja. Any other questions for this incredible panel? Yes.
Hi. So I was just wondering what you guys think about the Birthright program. I know a lot of have friends that are
The what program?
The Birthright.
Birthright.
I have a lot of friends that are Jewish or have been through that, or have been through Israel and have really great experiences that they tell me about. It sounds like like an amazing experience. But then it also puts a very pro-Israel light on them, and even to me, it sounds great. Like, it feels very welcoming. But at the same time, I also have Palestinian friends who have different
But what
points
could
of
be
view.
more racially supremacist than the concept that you have a right by birth to a place that you have never been, when the people who are from there cannot go back there? It's absurd. And in fact, JVP's youth group has started an anti-birthright campaign. So hopefully birthright will be a thing of the past soon. Any other? Do we have any real questions? We have really amazing people here who've spent their lives on this. I'm sorry?
Yes, hello.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Ali Larian. I'm a journalist with Al Jazeera English. Thank you to the panel for a great presentation. My question is actually for Suzanne. But before I ask my question, I just want to assure the audience that I am a vocal supporter of BDS, so please bear that in mind when I ask my question. You said during your response to one of the questions earlier that Israel is terrified of BDS, and you cited the fact that it's spent millions of dollars already fighting it. But this is also the same Israel that has spent the last 10 years lamenting Hamas rockets, which I'm sure everyone in this room knows are nothing more than firecrackers. And they spent billions of dollars on that so-called Iron Dome defense, which has also been discredited. So I just want to know, because while I think BDS is a great tactic, how are you so convinced, the way I would love to be convinced, that Israel truly is terrified of BDS and it's not just smokescreen?
So you're basing your question on the fact that they've spent, they use Hamas and are spending money on opposing Hamas, and I think these are two different. I think they're two different things. Israel's never been afraid of Hamas. That whole narrative, again, we're going back to these concocted narratives and this mythological sort of propaganda that they promulgate to the world. They've never been afraid of Hamas. At most, militarily, Hamas is like a little splinter. That's compared to their physical and military power. Hamas has been used really to for several reasons. To promulgate, again, this idea that they're victimized by their victims. They've been able to use Hamas as an excuse to launch repeated wars that are actually immensely profitable for them. Again, it's like Aja said, there's a lot of money involved, and I don't have time to get into how that works, but I'm sure you understand how every major attack on Gaza is hugely profitable, both for their military industry and then for the rebuilding industry and so on, and also for the overall sort of laboratory that is of Gaza, this sort of enclosed open air prison. On the other hand, and also to sort of extort money from the U.S. for the Iron Dome, to your example. BDS, I think, is different in that whereas Hamas is sort of part of the narrative that they created, BDS is our narrative. It's our retelling of what's happening. This is, Israel's able to counter sort of violent resistance from Palestinians in a more effective way when it comes to, in terms of their propaganda. But they just really don't have any kind of defenses against a popular, nonviolent call for liberty. BDS is essentially demanding universal dignity. They're demanding basic rights. And again, Israel doesn't really have a counter narrative to that. And the more that narrative is popularized, the more it is a threat. So in going back to violence versus nonviolence and so forth, I think that nonviolence has, I'm a big believer in violent resistance. I think it's our right. And I think that it has a place in resistance. Nonviolent resistance is ultimately a performance in many ways because it requires an audience. And nonviolent resistance in a dark room is pointless. So here is this sort of popular performance of resistance that allows everybody to engage, everybody who cares about social justice. And Israel has, again, no real power with the masses. They have really no mechanisms to speak to people. And what speaks to people, ordinary people, are concepts of justice, are concepts of fair play, of rights, of dignity, because we all understand that. And so so BDS shifts the resistance from sort of this political game, from negotiations, from the UN, from the political elite, and it brings it really to this sort of ground level landscape where Israel really doesn't have a whole lot of power. And all Israel can really do is try and shut it down. So that's why I think it's different, and I think that, and I do feel optimistic about it. And you know, we've gotten quite far with very little resources. And I think it's because, you know, there are so many people in the world who kind of get a sense that things just aren't quite right. But they don't know how they can participate. They don't know what to do, and now they have a chance to participate. And so it's a game changer. It's not you know, easy sailing either. I mean, we have a lot of challenges, and there's a lot of roadblocks being put up. But yeah, I do. I mean, you know, if without optimism, without hope, like, what's the point? And I do feel optimistic. I mean, just look at these amazing women. Look at all of you guys. I mean, this is hugely hopeful, and it's a huge reason for optimism in my view.
Thank you so much. Anybody else?
Hello. Thank you all for speaking. This is amazing. I'm happy to be here and to learn from you all. And I have a question, and this one gears more towards the landscape of right now in our country and worldwide. And so since 45 has been elected, it seems like we're in constant crisis mode, whether it's from DACA to more and more police brutality, neo-Nazis, you know, being more bolder than ever. And it seems like we're constantly going to rallies, we're constantly just in crisis mode. So my question is, and I don't really expect like a concrete answer because I think it's a question for the movement and for all movements in general, but how do we continue to build, like, how do y'all see us continuing to build a movement, continuing to be there for each other? And, you know, when we're in such a constant crisis of crisis, and on top of that, within the Palestine solidarity movement, y'all spoke about this a bit, but like, we're also being bombarded with these attacks left and right. So yeah, that's kind of it's a general question, it's a big question. I don't expect y'all to have concrete answers, but like, how do y'all see us going forward in this current climate as we see right now?
I want to say, you know, solidarity is not just about our shared struggle. It's also about our shared joy. And the biggest thing, we had some good times in Palestine, let me just say. They drink good, they eat good, they laugh good, you know what I mean? They dance good. We loved each other, and we spent time trying to love each other. And maybe some people didn't see the importance of that, but I believe that, you know, any movement cannot survive without the art of love, you know? And so we have to, as much as we fight, you know, me standing with Palestine is not because I'm against this or I'm against that. It's what I'm for. I'm for freedom. I'm for liberation. I'm for love. I want to see, you know, when we talk about this, we have to talk about, well, who are our people? Who do we see when we speak about we? Who's the we in the I? You know what I'm saying? And have we even imagined what freedom looks like? That's the role of the artist, you know, is to ask the questions that nobody wants to really engage in, and also push us to imagine what's possible, push us to to do things further. And so one of the things we're doing in South Florida, you know, we started a community music studio called Smoke Signal Studio, my partner and I, with the Dream Defenders. And we raise community funding money to start this studio. We do jam sessions in the backyard. We laugh, we love on each other, we have a good time. Our spirits get free, and it feeds us, it fuels us. Because one of the myths, you know, has been that we wouldn't be able to survive, the civil rights movement, whatever, without the church, et cetera. I mean, we needed the church. The church was our organizing place. You know, that's where a lot of black folks were organized. And so we have to remember to create spaces for us to practice what liberation looks like. To sit around and say, well, man, when we get free, you know, when I took a bunch of young girls from Palestine, from the Shaduk organization. They came here for IMU's gala, and I got to take them around all around New York City, and I showed them everything they could possibly want to know about New York, because they were hip-hop heads, and they really loved hip-hop. And I brought them to Last Poet's house, and they had pizza for the first time, and the most amazing conversation we had. You know, we're talking, oh, you know, when Palestine is free, like, that was our whole conversation. I did an exercise too when we were all together, all the artists this time, Palestine. It's like, we all have to start the story with, what does Palestine look like when it's free? We're not talking about it not being free. What does it look like? And when is Palestine free? What are we doing? Where are we? Who are we with? You know, who do we see there? What are we wearing? You know, what does the weather look like? That's the role of the artist, you know, and I'm not in the business or the art of enemy making. I don't think it's good for us as people, human beings who are trying to create counter narratives, to build more the narrative around enemies. So we have to build more narratives around camaraderie, and what does that look like, and how do we demonstrate camaraderie. And so what you're saying is, like, yeah, days get tough, things get hard, but I think that's part of the stigma, the emotional trauma that the media tries to do, and social media. Like, you got to get off social media sometimes, you know what I'm saying? Like, you know, my partner is one of the co-founders of Dream Defenders, and he did a speech where he talked at a RAD talk with for Law for Black Lives, and he talked about how he got so numb, you know, just flipping through so much death and brutalities. To some point, you just get numb. It becomes everyday news, and it's normalized. And that we can't make that normal. That can't be our norm. So I think everything you can do to practice what love looks like is an act of resistance, an act of freedom. And that's the way that I think we truly show solidarity, is what is our shared joy? What does our shared ideas of freedom look like?
Well, why don't we take inspiration from that and film our message to Doreen? Should we do that now?
Before we do that, I want to see if that's okay, Sarah. I want to respond to the woman who spoke earlier from Israel. It's hard for me to say this because I don't want to hurt your feelings. I don't like hurting people's feelings. But so let me just preface by saying that I think it takes courage for you to say what you did in a group like this. But I want you to notice how you prefaced your question with a narrative about your own turmoil, your own inner turmoil, how it's affecting you, and so forth. And I think a good place to start is to understand that this is not about you. When you were talking, what I was thinking about was this Time magazine headline after the Sabra and Shatila massacres. The Times headline, it was Newsweek. It said, because a lot of Israelis came out to protest, and the headline said, "Israel in turmoil." And it was really, so yeah, then what was news was how Israel was in turmoil over the fact that they had just massacred 2 refugee camps full of civilians. So I just wanted to say that to you. It's not about you, about the anguish of losing your privilege and how that might be lost, and how to deal with maybe the racism or of people who are your connections in Israel and so forth. It's about, you know, an entire society that is quite literally being erased. A very ancient society with a history, with traditions, with dance and song and food and stories and trees that are slowly no more. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a powerful note to end on. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Aja. Thank you, Radhika. Thank you, Sarah, for this amazing panel. They have all left us with a lot to think about. We want to invite you to become part of the movement today. In a minute with Shelva, we're going to do a video. But we did want to show you before that a video that Adalah-NY put out in November 2015, launching its cultural boycott campaign. Those of you that might want to sneak out before you do, make sure you grab a drink. Make sure you go to the book table. We have all of our amazing sponsors have books there, including books by these lovely ladies. Women, sorry, is that sexist? If I say it, I don't know. It's all good. But go check out the books, and we'll show you the video, and then Shelva's going to give us, all of us, the directions in terms of what we're going to do.
July 2010. Star Palestinian soccer player Mahmoud Sarsak is arrested on his way to a match. Israel holds him without charge for 3 years.
June 2013. El Hakawati Theatre is shut down by Israel days before the annual Palestinian Children's Theatre Festival is scheduled to begin.
August 2015. Palestinian-American author Susan Abulhawa is denied entry into Palestine on her way to build playgrounds for children.
In 1948, Zionist forces attacked villages across Palestine,
dispossessing 750,000 people.
Today, those refugees and their descendants are barred from returning home.
Since 1967, Israel has received $120 billion in U.S. aid.
subsidizing the demolition of homes,
The displacement of families,
the theft of farmland,
the arrest of children,
and the siege and blockade of the Gaza Strip.
This has become the longest-running military occupation in modern history.
Governments around the world refuse to take action against Israel's illegal policies.
Dozens of UN resolutions remain unenforced.
We must act where governments have failed.
In 2004, Palestinian civil society called for a cultural boycott of Israel.
targeting government and complicit institutions, not individuals. Cultural boycott is an ethical, rights-based tactic with historical precedent.
How can I perform in Israel when millions of Palestinians cannot attend?
How can I play in Israel knowing that the government will use my show to whitewash its crimes?
How can I participate in U.S. cultural projects funded by an apartheid government?
How can I tour in Israel knowing Palestinian artists are denied the right to travel?
How can I work with any institution complicit in Israeli human rights abuses?
From Cape Town
To Dublin,
From Montreal
to London,
From Beirut
To New York City.
Artists are raising their voices in support of cultural boycott.
refuse to play for apartheid.
Amplify your voice for justice.
Join the cultural boycott of Israel.
I endorse the cultural boycott of Israel.
I endorse
I endorse
I endorse the cultural boycott of Israel.
Still experiencing some technical difficulties, but you guys get the message, right? We are thankful for any and all donations, which you can also make at the merchandise table to enable us to continue to do these types of things. We invite you to sign the Amplify Palestine, the Cultural Boycott Pledge by New York City cultural workers that's on the Adalah-NY website. Join us also for a protest on October 25th against the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra at Carnegie Hall. And join Adalah-NY or Jewish Voice for Peace or any other organization that you feel comfortable with, and just like these ladies said, just start doing, because it needs to get done yesterday. All right?
It actually needs to get done tomorrow, and you can meet us at 6 p.m. Because Trump and Netanyahu are hanging out right now in our city. They had a special date today, and they're both gonna share, I'm sure, very heartfelt words to the UN General Assembly tomorrow. And so Jewish Voice for Peace, NYC, and American Muslims for Palestine, New Jersey are co-organizing, endorsed by a wide array of other groups, a protest, a big demonstration from 6 to 8 p.m., starting at the UN with a big, beautiful rally before marching to Trump Tower. And our hope is to turn out folks who've been turning out for the Muslim ban, for immigrant rights, against white supremacy. This is an intersectional movement. And perhaps tomorrow will be the first time some folks who have been turning out into the streets for those things will be turning out for Palestine. So please come and spread the word in whatever ways you can, and bring your friends and family.